Almost all of Tolkien's Middle-earth writings are concerned with what's going on in the west of that continent. It's the people of those lands who write the histories that we're all familiar with. But in this video, I want to focus on the east. It's fascinating, it's thought-provoking, and most of all, it's enormously mysterious. So here are some tantalizing facts about the mysteries of the East, which can hopefully germinate in your imaginations and grow into some of the coolest things to speculate on. Maya Govan and Melanin, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. So I suppose the first thing to say about the vast and mysterious east of Middle-earth is that it has a real identity to it. There's something primeval about the east. It's where you'll find the most ancient places. And as far as elves and men and dwarves are concerned, at least 4 dwarves and 7, it's also where their earliest ancestors came from. The east is the land of their awakening. So I'll start by talking about the mystical country of Cuiviénen, the waters of awakening far in the east of Middle-earth, where the very first elves first came into the world. Cuiviénen is a land of sweet water under starlight, and it lies on the eastern shore of a great lake called the Sea of Helcar. Its first inhabitants called themselves the Quendi, which in their own language means those who speak with voices. And from those original Quendi are descended all elves. Every single one that we know anything about left Cuiviénen, or at least their ancestors did, and they went westward to take part in one of Middle-earth's many stories. Some even made it to the uttermost west of Valinor, and they became the major characters in the early Silmarillion. But not all of them did. The most prehistoric and primal of all the elven kindreds are called the Avari. These are the darkest of all dark elves. And just remember, dark elves are not evil elves in Tolkien's writings, they are simply unenlightened by the divine light of Valinor. The Avari are the descendants, and maybe in some cases, like just the original elves, who lived at Cuiviénen in the Far East and refused to go on the great journey west with all of the main characters and their ancestors. But despite their ultra-mysterious nature, we do know a few things about some of these, I guess, indigenous elves of the East. At the time when the Quendi people, the elves, first split the sundering of the elves into those who would and would not go on the great journey westward, around a third of them chose not to go, and these unwilling elves are the Avari. And although the Avari pass out of almost all the stories, they, as a people, do not disappear. While the Noldor and the Sindar and the Sea Elves and the Wood Elves are all doing their thing and making the events of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit happen, the Avari are still kicking around. According to tradition, they had 2 leaders back in the day. One was called Morwe, a kinsman of the elves who went on to become the Noldor, and the other was Norwë, of the elves who went on to become the Sindar, and also the Wood Elves, and also the Sea Elves. And the Avari lived in at least 6 separate tribes, whose names demonstrate just how different the language of the Avari is from other elvish languages like Quenya or Sindarin. The 6 clans that we know of are called the Kindi, the Quind, the Hwenti, the Windan, the Kinlai, and the Penny. However, as perfect as it might seem having the longest continuous settlement in all of Middle-earth's history, the tale of the Avari is not an entirely happy one. We don't know how much truth there is to the legends, but it is believed by the other elves that some of these rustic originals were among those captured by Melkor in the very beginning and corrupted into his first orcs. Whether true or not, we do know that after the Great Journey had taken place, some of the Avari did make their own journeys west a little bit later, but when the other elves interacted with these Avari, they often found them secretive and even hostile, especially towards the Noldor. But that's not true of all Avari. Among the Sylvan elves of Mirkwood, the Wood Elves, there eventually developed quite friendly relationships between them and the mysterious Avari, and in time, Sylvan and Avarine populations even became merged together. So little is known of them, but it's very cool to think that even at the time of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, far away in the far east, the most rustic elves of them all are still living quiet lives of song and poetry near the waters of their awakening. And picture this. One day, in the late First Age, these Avari in the Far East look up, and for the first time ever, their perpetual everlasting nighttime gives way to the world's first sunrise. The years of starlight in Middle-earth are over, now there is day and night. The reason why that happened is because of what's going on in the uttermost west with the Noldor and the events of the Silmarillion, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Avari. But as the sun rises for the first time, as Middle-earth gets its first ever taste of daylight, it must have been a wildly confusing moment for these rustic elves of the East. And at the very moment of that first sunrise, far to the east of even Cuirvienen, about as far east as east goes in Middle-earth, something else happened that would fundamentally change the story forever. The first members of the race of men awoke and entered the world. Upon the shores of the Eastern Sea lies the easternmost country ever named by Tolkien, and it is remembered as Helidorien, the place where the first ever men came from. However, unfortunately for the race of men, Helidorien was not as nice as Cuirvienen was, and the reason for that is Melkor. Right at the beginning, Melkor placed a shadow in the hearts of the first men, and so in time their land fell into darkness. But not all men succumbed. Eventually there was war in Helidorien between those who'd fallen beneath the shadow and those who'd resisted it, and this war drove many men west. All men are descended from the men of Helidorien, and as these men ventured west following the sunset, they came to dwell in a wide range of lands. Many went quite a long way west and became the ancestors of the Númenóreans and the Rohirrim and the men of Dale and Bree and Dunland, but many others remained in the east, in the lands of Rhûn, and these guys are the ancestors of the Easterlings. And it was in the east that the first men met the first elves. They encountered Avari. They learned from the Avari, and in time, many men settled and formed large communities around the inland sea of Rhûn. These men lived here for a very long time. There were lots of them, and they occupied a large territory with an abundance of rivers and forests, and yet we know nothing about them. I think there are few places in Middle-earth that are quite so ripe for speculating on than the Sea of Rhûn. Easterlings have been living there for literally ages, but we can only guess at what they built there and how they lived. Except, we do know that these men also interacted with the Dwarves of the East. There are 7 dwarf clans in Middle-earth, although almost every single named dwarf belongs to the Longbeards, or Durin's folk. There are a few named dwarfs who hail from the Blue Mountains, and they belong to the Broadbeams or Firebeards, but the other 4 clans, the clans of the East, they are almost entirely a mystery. But we do know a few things. We know these Eastern Dwarves accumulated 4 vast treasure hoards. We know they accepted 4 rings of power from Sauron. We know they lost those hoards and those rings to dragons, and we know they fought in the War of the Last Alliance. Some certainly on the side of Sauron, but others potentially joining Gil-galad and Elendil and the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. And we also know that warriors from every one of those eastern clans, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, the Stiffbeards, and the Iron Fists, all came to the aid of the Longbeards during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. In the Battle of Azanulbizar, the army of Azog was destroyed by dwarves from all 7 houses. But that's about all we know for certain. In the northeast of Rhûn, there is a great mountain range called the Orakani, the Red Mountains, and on a diagram drawn in the 1930s, Tolkien also mentioned the Yellow Mountains in the southeast. Now, it isn't anywhere stated, but I think we can be relatively confident the Dwarves of the East would probably have had great mansions in the vast eastern mountain range, and although perhaps they wouldn't quite be on the same scale as Khazad-dûm, certainly I think they would be comparable to the great strongholds of Nogrod and Belagost in the Blue Mountains in the west, except that in the east there are twice as many of them, and they are another example of enormously fertile ground for our imaginations to wander in. Both the Red Mountains and the Yellow Mountains lie somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the Middle-earth map, so we can't really talk about the geography of these dwarven realms in the east, but we can talk about the Sea of Rhûn and the rivers that flow into it. You'll notice this inland sea has excellent connections to quite a few different settlements in the northeast of Middle-earth, namely the Iron Hills, the Lonely Mountain, and the woodland realm of Mirkwood. We know that some of Durin's folk, the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm, made a home for themselves in the Iron Hills, going back as far as the First Age, and it wasn't until about 2/3 of the way into the Third Age that the Lonely Mountain of Erebor became inhabited by Longbeards. So these Dwarves of the Iron Hills were, for most of their history, so far away from their home in Khazad-dûm, and enormously cut off from it by the vast and elvish Greenwood, later Mirkwood, which was even bigger in the First and Second Ages than it is in the Third. Surely, the only direction in which these Iron Hills dwarves could trade or, conveniently acquire things that aren't iron would be by following the direction of the River Carnen, the Redwater, all the way southeast into the Sea of Rhûn. Over the span of multiple ages, surely there must have developed some relatively formal trade centres on the North Shore where the river meets the sea, in which dwarves and Easterlings would, I imagine, interact and share customs and coexist, probably quite prosperously. And we can say with even more certainty that traders on the Sea of Rhûn definitely shipped their wares up the other river, the River Running, which runs through the caverns of Thranduil's kingdom in Mirkwood. I can't say how far back this trade goes, but by the time of The Hobbit, the Elven King was importing his finest wines from a far-off country on the shores of the Sea of Rhûn. And we're specifically told this wine is so potent, it will send even elves into a deep sleep if they get too drunk on it. Now, this land of wines in the southeast is called Dorwinion. And Dorwinion is, I think, one of the most intriguingly mysterious places in all of Middle-earth. I find it fascinating. Because Dorwinion, despite lying on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Rhûn and thus being one of the easternmost places on the map, is in fact an Elvish word. Dorwinion is Sindarin. Why does this warm, wine-producing country far, far, far away from where the main stories of Middle-earth are happening have a Sindarin name? Well, I've already told you pretty much everything we know about Dorwinion, so to talk more about it, we are going to have to get into some speculation, but as I see it, there are a few different routes for this speculation to go down. Maybe Dorwinion has an Elvish name because it's occupied by Elvish people. Perhaps Dorwinion is a realm of the Avari, who wandered far away from Cuir and came to dwell by another inland sea. Perhaps they learnt the art of cultivating vines and growing wine from local wood elves. Perhaps the link between Dorwinion and the woodland realm goes all the way back to its founding. Or perhaps Dorwinion is even older still. Maybe it was founded during the Elves' great journey west from Cuir all those millennia ago. We do know that the Tellarine elves on that journey tarried long on the shores of the Sea of Rhûn, learning to build ever larger and stronger boats. So it is entirely possible. But to be 100% honest, that's not what I believe. You are of course free to disagree, but in my opinion, Dorwinion is a land of men. But men whose home is known by an elvish name. There are any number of explanations for why this might be the case, but one of them has a decent amount of evidence to back it up. So, towards the beginning of the Third Age, in the year 541, a very long way away from Dorwinion, the 8th king of Gondor was killed in battle by a great army of Easterlings, and when he died, the crown passed to his son, a guy called Turambar. And the first thing Turambar did as king of Gondor was avenge his father, which he did really quite spectacularly. Not only did Turambar's army absolutely smash that great Easterling army and force the survivors back into Rhûn, then Turambar kept going. Good guys very rarely do this in Tolkien's writings, but during the reign of King Turambar, Gondor totally did try its hand at empire building. They pushed the Easterlings out of Gondor, and then they kept on conquering, entering the lands of Rhûn and winning new territory, bringing vast swathes of southeastern Middle-earth into Gondor's sphere of influence. And for a good whack of time, they held on to this territory. Fast forward 348 years after Turambar's death, and we'll arrive at the reign of his great-great-great-great-grandson, a king remembered to history as Hiarmendakil, the last of the mighty ship kings who ruled over Gondor's golden age. And back then, Elvish, specifically Sindarin, was the men of Gondor's mother tongue. During the reign of Hiarmendakil, the expansion of Gondor's territory reached its zenith. He ruled Gondor at the very pinnacle of its size and power. And we're told that in those days, the borders of Gondor extended as far east as the Sea of Rhûn, which would mean they include Dorwinion. I guess there are two ways of imagining how Dorwinion might fit into the kinda Gondorian Empire. It might have already existed as a long-established wine-producing country that was founded long before the coming of Gondor's influence and language to the region, or maybe it was founded specifically as a Gondorian outpost or colony, far, far, far away from the capital, Osgiliath. And it might seem like the former is more likely. After all, by the Third Age, men have been living around the Sea of Rhûn for a very, very long time. But, interestingly, Tolkien tells us in his Elvish lexicon that what Dorwinion means is young land. This obviously doesn't prove anything, but it does suggest Dorwinion isn't some ancient place like you'd expect other settlements around the Sea of Rhûn to be, which I think lends even more credence to this idea that by the time of The Hobbit, Dorwinion persists in the east as some long-lost colony of Gondor's former empire. And I say former empire because after the death of Hiarmendakil, the throne passed to his son, Atanatar. And Atanatar was a lazy king. He enjoyed splendor far too much, and he did far too little to maintain the golden age built by his ancestors. He took it for granted, and in the centuries that followed, Gondor never again reached the pinnacle of power that it knew in the reign of Hiarmendakil. But Dorwinion did not disappear. Almost 2,000 years after Hiarmendakil's time, the elven king of Mirkwood, Thranduil, was acquiring his finest, strongest wines from this mysterious country in the east. We can only speculate on what life might have been like in Dorwinion, but I'm imagining somewhere that's very colourful, very exciting, and also very dangerous. Because, of course, unfortunately for the east of Middle-earth, Mordor happens to be in it. And so the Easterlings have the misfortune of living within the Dark Lord's sphere of influence. For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, there is a shadow in the east, an enormously evil presence working tirelessly to corrupt vast swathes of Rhûn and to bring them under Sauron's dominion. But Dorwinion proves he wasn't wholly successful. There are people in the East who resist the Dark Lord. If you're trading with elves and identifying with an elvish word, you are not truly under Mordor's boot. I highly doubt the people of Dorwinion would still be speaking Sindarin as a first language by the time of the Lord of the Rings. The people of Gondor aren't. But perhaps there are some people who still remember how it used to be. Perhaps in secret, some Easterlings in Dorwinion preserve the old ways of the elf friends. Perhaps a Rhûn resistance movement uses Dorwinion as their stronghold. I imagine among Dorwinion's population there would be at least 2 names for their country, the Elvish name, Dorwinion, and a name from the languages of the East, which we don't know anything about. But depending which name any given person used would probably reveal where their loyalties lie, with Sauron or with his enemies. And if that's the case, then I imagine this country would be a little bit like Númenor was, when Sauron ruled that island as their high priest in the Second Age, and the Sindarin-speaking faithful Númenorians resisted the Dark Lord's cultists from the shadows. Except whereas Númenor is literally the land of the West, Dorwinion would be in a similar situation, but with a much more Eastern way of life. Their culture would be influenced much more by the people living around the Sea of Rhûn. Anyway, just before I move on, I want to take a moment to talk about that word, Rhûn. Just like Dorwinion, Rhûn is also an Elvish word, but contrary to what's sometimes suggested, it isn't like the name of a nation, or a kingdom, or a country, or anything like that. There is no realm of Rhûn. What Rhûn simply means is East. It's what the map makers in the West write in big letters over the far-off and uncharted lands they've never been to. I imagine an Easterling mapmaker, maybe living in Dorwinion, would have very detailed charts of their part of the world, but probably over the bits of Middle-earth that we are familiar with, they would just write the word West in whatever language they speak. That would be their label for the unknown regions between the mountains and the sea. I imagine there are a great many realms in Rhûn in the East, just like there are a great many realms in the West, but I'm confident those people of the East would not refer to themselves as being of Rhûn. They aren't runic, they would have their own names in their own languages for their own lands and nations, and they certainly would not identify themselves as Easterlings. That's just how they are collectively known by the people living in the West. Anyway, frustratingly, perhaps, Tolkien only ever provided us with one word in any language of Rhûn. One Easterling who gets a name, and that Easterling is called Khamûl, a bad guy, also known as the Shadow of the East. Khamûl is famous for being one of the 9 men, the only one to get a name, who accepts a ring of power from Sauron. Khamûl is a particularly nasty Nazgûl, second only to the Witch King himself. And he's another fascinating mystery of the East. I can't say anything about who he was before he became a ringwraith, except that his slow decline into absolute dominion as a slave of Sauron's coincided with a really dark period for the people of the East. Seriously, a terrible time to be an Easterling. So, in 1701 of the Second Age, the War of the Elves and Sauron came to an end. This was the war fought for the Rings of Power, in which Eregion fell, Celebrimbor was killed, and the 16 Lesser Rings of Power were taken by Sauron. One of these rings was given to Khamûl, but all Easterlings would surely have been affected when Sauron's rise to true dominance began. I should point out, despite doing very well in the many centuries that followed, Sauron actually lost the War of the Elves and Sauron, and so the northwest of Middle-earth, where High King Gil-galad rules, that is off limits. But Sauron has the south, and he has the east. The period of his dominion there in the Second Age is remembered as the Dark Years, and it represents, arguably, Sauron at his most successful. For about 1,560 years, Sauron ruled as a god king, the lord of the earth, and among his many, many subjects were the people of the East. During that astoundingly long period of time, Sauron worked his influence among the Easterlings, recruiting or perhaps conscripting large numbers of men to serve Mordor's cause, and deceiving the Easterlings with lies about the Elves, and about their friends, the Dunedain, the people of the West. Sauron had 1,500 years to sow a culture of hatred and resentment of the Westerners among the Easterlings, and this is a huge part of why in the Third Age there is so much recurring warfare between Gondor and various different nations of Easterlings, beginning not long after Gondor is founded and persisting until after The Lord of the Rings, into the reign of King Elessar, aka Aragorn. Now, I won't go into too much detail on these Easterling wars against Gondor, because although they are very interesting, they're not really particularly mysterious. When Easterlings go west and interact with the people who write the histories we're familiar with, we actually know quite a bit about them. But I will say, 700 years after King Hiarmendikil died, Gondor was attacked by a confederacy of various Easterling peoples who were incited to war by emissaries of Mordor, and they rode into Gondor on great horse-drawn war wagons called wains. These people are remembered in the West as the Wainriders. And the Wainriders were a major thorn in Gondor's side. In fact, for a decent length of time, they were the winners of the Wainrider War. Gondor's army was defeated, their allies, the Northmen, were also defeated, and their king Narmakil was slain. Also, the chieftain of the Northmen was slain, and most of his people were conquered and enslaved by this Easterling alliance. About 40 years later, many of these enslaved Northmen revolted against the Wainriders, and Narmakil's son, King Kalimetar of Gondor, saw this as his moment to strike back. He won a significant victory against the Wainriders, but it didn't really turn the tide of the war. The Easterlings simply united with Gondor's other enemies, the Haradrim, and they soon came back even stronger than ever. And so, 90 years after the Wainriders first attacked Gondor, they managed to kill another king in battle, Kalimetar's son, a guy called Ondoher. And they also killed both of Ondoher's sons, eventually also his sister's son, effectively leaving Gondor without any undisputed heir to the throne. After this military disaster, Ondoher's top general, a guy called Eärnil, ultimately avenged his king by finally expelling the Wainriders, but it's important to remember that for almost 100 years, this confederation of Easterlings brought the kingdom of Gondor to its knees. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. 566 years later, Gondor, now ruled by the stewards instead of kings, was attacked by another fierce army of Easterlings, this time a group known as the Balchoth. And the Balchoth are very interesting because unlike the Wainriders who allied with the men of Harad, the Balchoth allied themselves with orcs. They gathered at Sauron's stronghold of Dol Guldur in Mirkwood, and it appears that they were much more directly under the Dark Lord's influence than the Wainriders had been. But just like the Wainriders, the Balchoth were an enormously dangerous foe. They raided and overran the lands of the Northmen, who by now had developed a culture centered around horses and were calling themselves the Eotheod. And eventually, the Balchoth formed an army so large that the army of Gondor was almost entirely overwhelmed. Upon the field of Celebrant, the Balchoth forced the Gondorians into such a desperate situation. For a moment there, it looked as if this might be the end of the southern kingdom of the Dunedain. But when Gondor's need was greatest, in one of their darkest hours when defeat seemed all but inevitable, 7,000 riders of the Eotheod came to the Dunedain's aid. They broke the Balchoth host and they saved their Gondorian allies. As an act of gratitude, the steward of Gondor gave to the Eotheod the lands of Calenarthon, and very soon after that, Calenarthon became known as Rohan. The Eotheod became the Rohirrim. Anyway, I guess the point I'm making here is that the great armies of the East, the Wainriders and the Balchoth, are a lot more than just like low-level raiding parties. On a number of occasions, they went toe-to-toe with arguably the mightiest military power of their day, and they represented a truly existential threat to the realm of Gondor more than once. However, there is one more country in the east of Middle-earth that I really want to talk about, and getting back onto the topic of mysteries, these people are about as mysterious as they come. You see, to the southeast of Mordor lies the land of Khand. And like so many places that are far away from where the story takes place, Khand is a location we know nothing about, except that they allied with the Wainriders in their war against Gondor, and then 1,000 years later, they allied with Mordor and the Easterlings again during the Lord of the Rings. When the Riders of Rohan come to Gondor's defense again, echoing the Battle of Celebrant with the Battle of Pelennor Fields, they faced a force of orcs and Easterlings and Haradrim and Variags of Khand. And that's it. That's basically everything we know about Khand and its inhabitants. Some of them were called Variags. But what a Variag is, or how they differ from the regular folk of Khand, is never ever stated by Tolkien. However, that word, Variag, is a very interesting one, because it's not a word that Tolkien invented. In real life, in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, there was a group of Vikings, mainly from Sweden, who left the north and ventured far into the east and south of Europe. Some of them were traders, some of them were raiders, and some of them were mercenaries. And at the same time, one of the great empires of Europe was what remained of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which was at the time called the Byzantine Empire, and their capital was Byzantium, the city we now call Istanbul in Turkey, so a long way away from Sweden. And yet, within the Byzantine army, there was an elite group of warriors known as the Varangian Guard. And these cream-of-the-crop mercenaries were almost entirely recruited from far-off northern foreigners. Some of them were Tolkien's beloved Anglo-Saxons, but the majority of the Varangian Guard were made up of Swedish Vikings. And if you are a speaker of an East Slavic language, like, for example, Russian, the word Varangian is often rendered as Variag. So, obviously, this doesn't confirm anything about Middle-earth, but the fact that Tolkien referred to these warriors of Khand as Variags suggests to me that they are not the native population of that land. Presumably, there are people of Khand who've lived there for millennia, but my assumption would be that the Variags are not among them. I would speculate that the Variags of Khand are mercenaries, probably hailing from Angmar or Rhudaur or some other Sauron-worshipping land far in the north of Middle-earth, and they came to Khand, I imagine, simply to fight in Mordor's army. And so I reckon within Khand there'd probably be quite a significant divide between the local inhabitants who've lived there for ages and the warlike Variags who came as mercenaries. Anyway, before I finish this video, there is one more mystery of the East that I simply have to mention. Those 3 wizards who journeyed there long ago, and specifically, the 2 who never came back. So, in the Unfinished Tales, we are told that all 5 wizards of the Astari arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age. After that, Gandalf wandered all over the place without settling anywhere, Radagast set up shop in Mirkwood, and Saruman and the Blue Wizards went east. What they did there is very hard to say. We know that after 1,500 years, Saruman returned to the west of Middle-earth, and then he spent a good deal of time in Minas Tirith poring over their archives before finally taking up residence in Isengard. I imagine Saruman's mission in the east had quite a lot to do with studying the lore of Rings of Power. That's his area of expertise. But the 2 blue wizards, they are one of Tolkien's most enduring mysteries. And in those writings from Unfinished Tales, we are told that these wizards of the East possibly went down quite a sinister path. Their names were Alatar and Palando, but that was not known in the West, for they passed into the East with Saruman, and they never returned. And whether they remained in the East, pursuing there the purpose for which they were sent, or perished, or, as some hold, were ensnared by Sauron and became his servants, is not now known. However, in letter 211, Tolkien expanded on this dark side version by telling us, "I really do not know anything clearly about the other two wizards. I think they went as emissaries to distant regions, missionaries to enemy-occupied lands, as it were. What success they had there I do not know, but I fear that they failed, as Saruman did, and I suspect they were founders and beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron." Which sounds terrible. Imagine being a person of the East who identifies as an enemy of Sauron. Not only do you have to deal with the Dark Lord's influence over your lands and his many cultists and his emissaries stoking hatred and violence, you also have to deal with two dark wizards kicking around, founders of secret evil cults, which don't even go away when Sauron does. Imagine you're an Easterling who resisted Mordor all throughout the War of the Ring. At the end of that war, you realize Sauron's power has been destroyed, and Mordor has fallen. But while the folk in the West are celebrating the return of their king, you and your friends in the East still have to overcome those two failed wizards, whose dark magic traditions have outlasted even Sauron's dark magic traditions. That would suck. However, there is more to it than just that. This information about Alatar and Palando turning to the dark side comes from writings that Tolkien penned in the 1950s. But in the 1970s, towards the very end of his life, Tolkien changed his mind about the Blue Wizards, and he gave them a totally different story. In both versions, the Blue Wizards go east, and they never return. But in his later writings, Tolkien tells us they arrived in Middle-earth much, much earlier than the other three wizards, and their names were not Alatar and Palando. According to these later writings, the Blue Wizards were called Morinatar and Romestamo, and they arrived in Middle-earth in the Second Age instead of the Third. And in these final writings, the Blue Wizards not only stay true to their task to aid the Free Peoples in their resistance against Sauron, they also play a really key role behind the scenes in preventing the Dark Lord's ultimate victory. We are told their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. Not unlike Gandalf did in the Northwest, it seems Morinatar and Romestamo spread wisdom and counsel among the East, uniting the men who resisted Sauron and aiding them in their rebellions against the Dark Lord, exactly like they were supposed to. And according to these later writings, their plan worked. Morinatar and Romestamo must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would, both in the Second Age and Third Age otherwise, have outnumbered the West. Isn't that a cool thing to think about? Over the span of the Second and Third Ages, while Sauron was consolidating his power and influence over the East, according to these later writings, there were two wizards working in secret to help the Easterlings, and potentially also the men of the South, overcome the Dark Lord, aiding rebels, spreading hope, and scuppering Sauron's plans. Maybe the Wainriders would have been mighty enough to completely destroy Gondor in the early Third Age, if not for the Blue Wizards sowing resistance in the East. Perhaps the Balchoth would have snuffed out the Rohirrim before they even were the Rohirrim, but they couldn't, because somewhere to the east of the Sea of Rhûn, a Blue Wizard was reminding the Easterlings that no matter what he claimed, Sauron was not their friend. The shadow that Melkor placed in the hearts of men way back in Helidorian, in the very beginning, must be resisted. And ultimately, because they did, the East was spared from the full extent of the Dark Lord's dominion. In the end, goodness prevailed, and the shadow of Sauron was ultimately overcome. So, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. But until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.